Yeah, no, Lebanese, I don't, they just culturally have big personalities. You know, Lebanese are, they live large. So,
Yeah, I guess with all the situation, like the situation that happens in Lebanon, they're always like working hard and partying hard. It's like they only live on extremes. They can't
yeah.
handle just being stable.
Yeah, I was there once. I was there 23 years ago, and I got that sense. You know, I got the sense work hard, live hard. Um, no, it was. I really enjoyed my time there. I wish I could have spent more. Have you guys spent much time back there?
Oh yeah, we
Yeah.
lived there. We grew up there pretty much, and we go
Okay,
there every few months or so.
no
Yeah,
kidding.
I haven't been
Okay,
there in like a year or two, honestly. Mostly
right.
because of the unfortunate situation there.
Yeah,
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 it's hard to be there during war times, but
no
otherwise,
doubt.
but yeah, building a life here in Los Angeles, following your footsteps, walking around everywhere. What am
Cool.
I gonna
Yeah.
do? I mean, Rolf, to be honest, we started this podcast 2020. I
Hmm.
had read Vagabonding 2019 or so, and it got me really thinking about traveling and such. And then COVID hit us,
Hmm.
and so we started this podcast. And our main goal for this podcast was to go to as many countries as possible
Okay.
virtually. Yeah, at the time. So now we've had like 90 or so podcasts, traveling around the world virtually, meeting all kinds of people. And yeah, it's kind of amazing. Like the more you meet people around the world, the more you realize we're all kind of the same,
Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you so much for your time, Rolf. Great inspiration for the podcast. And yeah, Rolf Potts, let's get into it, is a travel writer, a traveler, a vagabonder. He's written many books: Vagabond's Way, Marco Polo, Souvenir, Vagabonding, more. Wow, what a great living legend here on the podcast. But my question I want to know, Rolf, is why? Why? Why do you travel
Why?
so much? Because like when I grew up, they told us that I had to live, get a nice job, get a
Right. Yeah.
nice wife, start having a family, focus on those things. No one ever told me I had to travel all the time until I encountered your writings.
Yeah, well, a lot of what vagabonding is about giving yourself permission to travel. I think oftentimes we assume we can't travel for whatever reason because we need our job and our wife, or because we don't really have anybody else in our lives who does much travel, or the
Hmm.
travels they take are really short vacation type travels, and we don't realize that we have permission if we want to give ourselves permission to travel for a long time, to travel in a way that can actually change our life instead of just escape from our life. And so I grew up in a pretty isolated part of the country. You guys sound pretty international, but I grew up in
Hmm.
Kansas. Nobody in my family had a passport. And so I assumed that travel was something you gave to yourself at the end of life when you'd retired from a life of hard work and you'd raised your family. But then, my grandfather was a Kansas farmer and he had worked harder than anybody I knew. But by the time he was to retirement age, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease. He had to stay home and take care of her. Not that he dreamed of travel, but he just wasn't able to enjoy the end of his life like we assumed he could. And
Yeah.
so at a very young age, I thought, man, I've always dreamed of travel, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it if I wait till the end of my life. So um, I got a van. They call it van life now, but at the time it was just being a dirtbag and buying an old van. And a buddy and I we traveled around America for 8 months, and man, it was cheaper and it was safer and it was easier than we thought it would be. And by the end of the trip, we realized we hadn't spent any more money than we'd spent at home, and so it wasn't, if you travel in such a way that you're not just throwing money at your travels, but you're just sort of living your life on the road, then it's much more doable. So in a certain way, I'm still on that trip that started when I was 23 years old.
Wow.
Um, and I have a home base again here in Kansas, and I actually have a wife, and I'm really happy being a married guy. But
Congrats.
thank you, yeah. Um, but I just realized that you can integrate your travel into your life in such a way that you don't, air quotes, ruin your life. That travel can be an active part of your life, and it can be in conversation with the life you live at home. And you can do all those things that maybe your parents encourage you to do, but you can do them on your own terms. And instead of sort of stepping into a life that others want you to live, you can create your own life through a mix of travel and other things. Again, I say don't be a knucklehead. Don't just spend your whole time traveling, partying, and spending all your money and not learning anything. But in a way, travel can be the best education. It can be the best way to inform how to live the rest of your life, in part, and before we started recording, you guys were talking about it. You learn so much from other people and other cultures. You realize that we're all in this same journey together, and you can incorporate parts of other cultures into your life in ways that, America is just one way to live. And so there's other ways to really live a rich life, even if you aren't rich, for example, or even if you aren't super mobile. There's just some super cool ways. There's some wisdom out there, I think, that oftentimes in a wealthy country like the United States, we don't think about that much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do you think about that, Saeed?
I like the wisdom that you mentioned that you can find out when you on your travels, and I guess that partially answers my question, which was, why do people want to travel in the first place? Because, like Ali was mentioning, when you travel, you see like everyone's the same, so you can find the same characters, the same personalities in your own country as well.
Yeah, well, I think travel is our original condition, like of man. Historically, cities are pretty new. We used to live nomadically. We used to follow our herds and follow the seasons around the earth. And so I think it's hardwired. To a certain extent, moving around a lot is hardwired into who we are as humans. And so, yeah, I just think it's a pretty universal thing. I think I've never said you have to travel. Like if somebody doesn't want to travel, that's fine with me. That it's not like, you're uncool or your life is not complete if you don't travel. If somebody really likes to stay in their hometown their whole life, that's fine with me. But I think it's a pretty common human thing to be curious about other places, and to just deepen your life in a certain sense. And even not to be too much about anthropological history, but for years, if you lived in your own town the whole time, you'd run out of people to marry, because everybody's your cousin. Right? So you enrich your life by going to the next valley over and meeting some strangers and maybe marrying into another culture and then having alliances with them. And so I think that travel has always been how we have communicated across cultural lines. That there are ways to interact with people and to form bonds, even if you don't get married to the person in the next valley over, just to become more human to each other. It's just a great thing to happen. And I will say that like the travel industry sort of makes it seem like travel is a consumer experience. Oh, you can go to this place and eat at this restaurant and buy these souvenirs and see these sites, when in fact, I think travel, since for as long as people have been around, is about creating those bonds, is about expanding your social capital, going out and finding ways to enrich your life and have ideas to bring back. And are you guys familiar with the hero's myth?
Yeah, totally. The hero's journey.
I'm not sure about it. What is it about?
Joseph Campbell. It's Joseph Campbell studied storytelling traditions from around the world, and he realized that they all have in common this hero's myth. A story basically about a young man who leaves the village, travels the world, has all these obstacles. I mean, like, one of the biggest fans of the hero's myth was George Lucas. So Star Wars is literally about the hero's myth, about Luke Skywalker leaving his planet and having these adventures. But then part of the hero's myth is coming back. And when you come back, it's not just good for you, but your travels enrich your home community, that you can bring back wisdom and technology and perspective, that that travel is not just good for the traveler, but it's good for the community that sends the traveler or that hosts the traveler when he or she comes back. So I'm a big believer in all of that. And my wife and I traveled to Kenya this summer, and we were just so excited. We felt like kids because that was new too, and we learned so much.
Right. I mean, speaking of the hero's journey, one of the things I thought about a lot while reading your books is Lord of the Rings, because it's all about walking and walking and walking until something happens.
Yeah.
That's kind of your philosophy, isn't it? Just walk and walk and walk until something comes your way.
Yeah, no, it's a great default. Because sometimes, again, if we go into travel with the idea that we're consumers of travel, it's like, oh, where am I going to sleep? Where am I going to stay? What am I going to see? What am I going to do? Oh my God, I'm a little bit bored. I don't know what I'm going to do next. It's like, we'll go for a walk. Walk until your day becomes interesting. That's my catchphrase that goes back to my first book, Vagabonding. It's in the Vagabond's way too. That basically says that, I mean, you're an outsider in a place, and I think you walk, and then pretty soon you're paying attention in a way that you haven't paid attention before. And so I'm a huge believer in it. And even at home, I've really become more of a walker than I used to be. It's funny, if you communicate a philosophy enough verbally, then you sort of have to live it, right? So I was living the walk until your day becomes interesting philosophy on my travels, but I would come home and I realized that there's areas around where I live that I don't know that well. So walking is a big thing for me. And actually, my wife and I, one of our anniversary traditions is that we walk to the towns near us. And so there's like an 8-mile walk to one town. We have lunch there, and a 12-mile walk to the next town. And we just see so much. I think we live lives through our screens so much these days that we forget that the natural world and that our own neighborhood is so full of things that are there if we just pay attention. That we'll be walking down the road and it's like, is that an owl up in the tree? There's an owl that lives like 700 meters from our house. And so walking is something that just opens the door to what we haven't previously been paying attention to, either at home or on the road.
Yeah.
I want to go on tech a bit. Nowadays you can go on ChatGPT, type, I'm going to France for a week. I like food. I like comedy. I like whatever. Give me a travel itinerary, and it'll give you a very detailed travel itinerary, where to stay and such. So what do you think about the tech that's coming on nowadays? I mean, artificial intelligence, smartphones and such. I mean, is it a tool for travelers, or is it an enemy?
Well, it's both, the answer is yes. And I think that technology has always changed the way people travel and the way people think about travel. Because years ago, when they invented steamships, people who were used to sailing on sailing ships are like, yeah, this is too fast. Nobody's really, or railroads, it's like, you used to have to walk to this village and now you take a train and you don't even pay attention to it. Well, technology has always changed that in ways that are good and are bad. And I think George Orwell talked about how he can complain about how he experiences less of England when he travels by train, but it's not like he's not going to take a train. It's not like he's going to walk to London every time he wants to get there from Scotland.
Yeah.
And so I think AI is going to solve some travel problems that maybe some problems didn't even occur to us, but that doesn't mean that we're just going to swim in the pool of AI. We need to balance using technology with not using technology. Like when I first started traveling, when I was in my 20s, it was the 1990s, and there weren't smartphones, for example, and we did fine. I think a lot of young travelers are really worried that if they don't have their smartphone, they're going to miss something. Well, you figure things out. And so I think AI is just going to streamline some things, but you really have to know when to put it away. And I haven't used a ton of AI, but I teach a writing class in Paris each summer, and my students, we used an AI to write an essay about Paris. Excuse me.
Saha.
You're all good. Yeah.
And it got so much wrong. It's like, you can see this painting, Starry Night in the Louvre, and it's like, no, that's in New York. That painting's in New York. So I think that AI is not always as smart as you think it would be. But of course, AI is going to get smarter.
Yeah.
But it's not, I think it's sort of a matter of expectations versus reality. You can have your expectations optimized by AI or your smartphone or whatever. But if you're only comparing expectations, like if you're not walking until your day becomes interesting, then you're going to be in this little bubble of your expectations. Oh, there's the Louvre. The line is longer than I thought it would be. The paintings are smaller than I thought it'd be. This kind of sucks. Well, no, it's the Louvre, and then if the line is too long, just wander off someplace. The Seine is pretty close. There's all these cool neighborhoods. And again, it's about giving yourself permission. So I think you can use tools like AI, but as long as you give yourself permission to not use them, otherwise you're just going to be in this force field. And as it stands now, AI is just harvesting information, human created information that's out there anyway. And so, at least in the short term, travel AI is going to be kind of boring. It's going to take you to all those top 10 list places that everybody else goes to. And pretty soon you're going to be standing in line with all the other people who are using their AI, and they're going to be sort of irritated that each other are there. When like 10 blocks away, there's a cool place where maybe the Parisians hang out, and they're not using AI because it's their neighborhood. So I think one cool thing that you can do as a traveler is try to approximate the life of someone who's living there. That when you go to Paris, not Parisians aren't standing in life for the Louvre. They're having 3-hour lunches. When you go to a village in Peru, the kids aren't taking a guided tour. They're playing soccer in the village square. And so you have permission to play, to have fun, to go to a local concert and just sort of figure things out, sort of be a detective of your travels instead of having AI do all the work for you. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's funny how technology always has been and always will be a part of the conversation. And you know, as I get older, I get a little nervous by new technology. That's sort of an old people thing to do, but I think it's all about that balance. It's really realizing that many travelers were there before these new technologies and they did fine. But at the same time, there are things to solve your problems. And so I think the biggest problem that technology can do sometimes is that it takes home with you. You know, you travel to leave home, but then suddenly, like when I was in the traveling in the 1990s, I couldn't text my mom. You know, I couldn't take a picture and then post it on an interface, and then all my friends were commenting about it. And so pretty soon I'm in Thailand or I'm in Uzbekistan or wherever, and I'm suddenly having a conversation with my knucklehead friends back home. When in fact, if I was more disciplined, and I'm pretty good at this, then I would just be completely committing myself to this place rather than completely interfacing everything through technology. So
Yeah.
it's all about balance, and there's no silver bullet.
I mean, I would say that philosophy also extends to not in travel, just in daily life. You know, like yes, smartphones are a tool, but if you're too dependent on them, you're not going to be able to see what's in front of you. I think a huge problem we have is we're not able to deal with boredom, and I think in traveling, people are afraid of getting lost. You know, wandering off, not knowing where they are, boredom. You know, and
Yeah.
so I don't know, but I've heard you say that it's a good thing for you, that it's good for you to be bored and it's good for you to be lost and for your brain to just take it slow.
Yeah, no, that's an accidental mantra that I have that I realized I kept encouraging people to be lonely, lost, and bored so much that actually on another podcast, this guy was interviewing me. He said, I have lonely, lost, and bored on my screen when I travel, on my phone screen when I travel. So when and it's because of you, Rolf. And so it's like, oh, okay. So when he picks up his phone to do something that would counteract his loneliness, lostness, or boredom, he realized, oh, well, maybe I should work past these without using my phone, because for thousands of years travelers they've had to deal with boredom, and sometimes you're just bored because you're not imaginative enough to look closer to where you are. You're lonely because you're used to talking, chatting with your friends back home, but maybe you should try to strike up a conversation with someone who might not completely understand you, but it would be cool to talk with. Again, my wife and I were just in Kenya, and it was part of the reward of being there was just the fact that Kenyans were really interested in us, and actually Kenyans speak pretty good English, and so in a way, if we were worried about being lonely all the time and looking at our phone, then we would have missed the opportunity to meet all these cool Kenyan people, and then being lost too. That it's so easy to not be lost when in fact sometimes you take a wrong turn and suddenly it's like, wow, this neighborhood is more interesting than where I thought I wanted to be, or you're suddenly looking at details. We also went to Paris this summer, and my wife had a sketchbook, and so she was wandering around. She got a little bit lost, but she found all these great carvings on the buildings, and so she would just sketch these into her building. And then as she sat still to sketch, then suddenly she realized, oh, there's a like a celebrity funeral. A fashion designer died, and now there's this crazy French funeral going on. So it was just by willing to be lost and sort of going into a place that she didn't have any expectations for, that she was able to surprise herself by paying more attention to buildings. And then suddenly she was in the middle of a celebrity funeral without even realizing that. I'm not saying that every time you get lost, you're going to wander into a celebrity funeral, but yeah, I think just, again, giving yourself permission to experience these things a little bit. And as you said, even at home, we're nervous to allow ourselves to be lonely, lost, or bored, when in fact humans are the best computers ever. We've always had the ability to deal with these things, and so and travel is a place for us to re-experience these. We're a beginner again, so we can put our brain in that space of being a beginner in a way that is really rewarding.
Yeah, I like also in I watched one of your conferences, like maybe it was like 8 years ago, and you were saying that you advise people to, when they're traveling, to walk away from the touristic path, to walk off the touristic path. And I really enjoy that point that you made, because it promotes people to trust their instincts, and also it unlocks a certain level of awareness when they're going down that path, because it triggers obviously survival instincts because it's pushing on that mantra that you mentioned, which was you're alone, you're bored because you don't have anything to do, but you're trying to find something to do, and you're just surviving there. It's just like you're aware, you're awake.
Yeah, and you're using your brain in a new way. I mean, there's you have awareness and attention. It's heightened when you're away from where you think you're supposed to be, and you don't have to wander that far from the tourist attraction. But also the hippocampus in the human brain, our hippocampus is probably at the weakest in human history, because the hippocampus is where we use to figure things out, to figure out our spatial awareness, how to get around. They said that London taxi drivers before smartphones had some of the most developed hippocampuses because they had memorized all these streets. They had like just situationally figured out where they were. And so their hippocampus was really strong. And actually, the weaker your hippocampus, the more likely you are to suffer from things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And so it's actually a good practice to wander off where you're supposed to be, or put your phone away and use your brain in the way that it's designed to be. That in a way, the smartphone is sort of a weaker, faker brain. It's more convenient, but in a way, your brain already has all those tools. And it's actually not that scary. I encourage people to use common sense. Don't, wander around in the middle of the night through a dangerous neighborhood.
Yes.
But for the most part, you walk 13 blocks away from that tourist attraction. Suddenly you're more engaged. You have more awareness. Your attention is drifting in ways that you hadn't expected it to. And then your smartphone is your brain, and your brain is a better tool anyway. So yeah, I'm a big fan of traveling that way.
Have you ever gotten brain scans, Rolf? Just out of curiosity of yourself.
No, I haven't. Have you? Okay.
Rolf, so
Ali, where were you going with that, Ali?
No, I'm just curious. You're a traveler. I mean, you know what I mean? It's you put yourself through an experiment of life, and you've lived a really unconventional life that is interesting, and I'd be curious to learn about. I'm interested in the brain and such, so it's interesting that you're talking about the hippocampus and how much we're losing our memory and our spatial awareness and such, and so yeah, it'd be interesting to see your brain scans.
That's not a little bit creepy, no, not at all.
Now I'm nervous, like what if they scan my brain? It's like, oh yeah, your hippocampus is really weak, dude.
Do you think, by the way, with all of this that you've done, your brain is like maybe much more developed in a way that your memory retention is far superior to like the average person, and also you're avoiding things like dementia and Alzheimer's in the future?
Possibly. My mother has dementia now, and so maybe genetically I'm predisposed to that. But and I think there's better reasons to practice getting lost than just to preempt dementia. Although we could turn a whole generation of people into travelers by underpinning that health connection. But we talk about technology. One of the first people to complain about technology was Plato, who was nervous that the printed word would compromise people's ability to memorize things. Because before they had scrolls full of written words, people in the ancient world, they would just memorize giant poems. I mean, you guys have Lebanese tradition,
right,
poetry.
Totally.
The Arabic poetry tradition is amazing, and it's an oral tradition. And so, one of those earliest concerns was, Plato was worried that people wouldn't memorize as much, and that's a brain issue too. He was worried that people's brains wouldn't be as strong. So it's still a thing, and it's still literally our smartphone, which is not as smart as our own brain, is compromising our ability to use our already healthy brain. And so I guess that's just a health benefit of travel that's never mentioned, just sort of allowing yourself to use your brain in the way that it's always been used, and to improve your memory and your spatial awareness, and to realize that we are problem-solving creatures, that if we get in the habit of always checking our phone when we're nervous or lonely, lost, or bored, or trying to solve a problem, well, then we're missing out on the ability to use this amazing thing we have inside of our skull, which is a brain, which can do so much, and that invented the smartphone, right? So, So that's a great thing. That's a great part of the traveler's toolkit, just to realize that getting lost is cross training for your brain. There's just some great that it's not as, and again, we should be safe as travelers, but that worst case scenario rarely happens. And then suddenly, because the unexpected happens in our travels, we're not just using our brain in a new way, but we're having these great experiences and maybe meeting people that we hadn't expected to meet. And we're making our lives deeper and more interesting.
Yeah, that's very true. And so what do you think is a very important skill that people should practice when they're going on these kind of travels?
I think it ties into what we've already been talking about, and that's just openness to change, to changing your plans when you discover something better. I've met short-term travelers who are like, yeah, I went to this amazing beach for the first couple of days, but I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't because I had already, had a hotel up in the city or the mountains or something. And it's like, well, give yourself permission to fall in love with a place, or a person or whatever captures your attention. That sometimes we're so worried about doing travel right, that air quotes right, that we overplan things. We plan to the minute of each day when in fact we are smarter after 1 day, 1 week on the road than we are back home. And so you can plan every aspect of your travels in front of your laptop at home, but then suddenly you're on the road and you're learning new things, and you meet a cool person from this neighborhood, and it's like, oh, don't go to that. You'll just wait in line half the day. That's a tourist attraction. Come, my cousin's getting a wedding. Come to this wedding. And if you've planned everything, then suddenly you've missed the opportunity to do something spontaneous. And I mentioned wedding intentionally because I've been in places. It's never happened in Lebanon. Maybe someday, inshallah, right? But in India, I was invited to a wedding just because I was wandering around, and it's like, how awesome is that? And the funny thing is that they thought it was really cool that this sweaty American guy was at the wedding. Like somehow I had made their wedding international, and they had made my day way more interesting. And had I been hewing to an itinerary where I was just like, oh no, I've got to finish this and get on to the next place, then I would have allowed myself to be surprised. So I guess that's just a roundabout way of saying that one of the best travel tools is openness and not over planning. Or if you have plans, being willing to break your plans if you find something better.
Rolf, how many photos do you take for your own memory? How many photos do you just, when you're in an iconic place?
That's a good question. It's funny. My first vagabonding trip was living in a van and traveling around North America when I was 1994. I have a photo album, and like all 8 months, I have maybe 50 photos. That was back when you took film cameras and you had to take your film to get developed and stuff. And it's just like, but in a way, that was the best trip of my life. I'm not saying it was because I didn't take very many photos, but I was just so young. It was a new trip. Now I easily take 50 photos a day, if not an hour. My wife and I, we climbed Mount Kenya this summer, and you take a bunch of photos and you throw away the ones that aren't good, and you keep the good ones. So yeah, I do have a frame of reference, and so I would say as far as pictures I keep, I try to be pretty disciplined about throwing away the mediocre photos. But yeah, I'll take maybe 20 to 40 photos a day, and that's sort of a way of marking my travels. But if you read the Vagabond's Way, you know that I also talk about how photography can get in the way of your travels. If you're always putting your smartphone camera between yourself and an experience, then you're not really looking with your eyes. And so again, it goes back to that idea of balance. Being open to the spontaneous experience of travel. Excuse me. And documenting it for your memory, but not in such a way that you can't create new memories because you're only remembering taking photos, right?
Yeah.
This is an expectations versus reality thing too. Like the AI might say, oh, these are the 10 things you do in Paris. And then you're doing exactly what it told you to do. And it's like, well, the AI harvested that information from the internet. So why don't you just read the internet and look at the same photos you just took, right? And so,
wow.
One thing I talk about in the Vagabond's Way is take photos of what surprises you, because sure, you can take a picture of the Eiffel Tower, but it's not that hard to find a better picture of the Eiffel Tower online. But if you find something really weird, if you find people having this really extravagant Central Asian food feast there, or if you see guys selling, little models of the Eiffel Tower that are cool, and they have their own interaction, and they're from West Africa, and then it sort of makes that part of the Eiffel Tower West African. Those are the surprises that might be as interesting as taking as the Eiffel Tower itself. Now, I will say that my wife, who had less experience in Paris than I did, she wanted a picture of herself in front of the Eiffel Tower. Like it's not like she wanted to bypass a traditional photo of her looking cool in front of the Eiffel Tower. But I think sometimes too, it's good to challenge yourself to see what you might have missed if you're just looking for that generic picture. The great thing about the Eiffel Tower is that it's full of people who are so happy to be there. There's people from, Brazil and Japan, all these people who it's like, this is what I've seen in pictures my whole life. And now I'm standing in front of it, and it's so big and it's so amazing. And that happens almost anywhere in the world where you have a famous place. People they feel like they've finally made it. And that's part of the energy too, that sometimes, sometimes the energy of your fellow travelers is part of your energy there. I teach a class in Paris every summer. And once we had a student from Brunei, and she was celebrating Ramadan during the summer. And the day is much longer in Paris. Like Ramadan is harder in Paris because the day is light until like 10 o'clock. The other students and I took turns, like each day we took one day celebrating Ramadan with her. And it was so hard. It's like she was doing it every day. And it's like, gosh, I'm so hungry. But that really made us, that was sort of an experience of Brunei for us, that because she was cool and we liked her, that it's like, okay, today is my turn to do Ramadan with Huwaida. And it was a cool experience. And so even though we were in Paris, I guess I'm drifting from your question about cameras, but just the idea that sometimes what's happening in Paris is not only about Paris. You might have a group of tourists from Brunei or from Colorado or wherever. And suddenly I guess every place is more international than you give it credit for, that you might, I use Paris because I go there a lot. You might be in a neighborhood and everybody around is from Cote d'Ivoire, everybody's from West Africa, and their iteration of Paris is going to be super interesting. And it belongs to Paris too, Before we started recording, I was saying how I grew up in a town where the business community is all Lebanese American, right? So you go, you eat a delicious meal in Wichita, Kansas, and you're in Lebanon a little bit too. So I think we can no longer pretend that any part of the world is separate from the rest of the world. Wow. So if you're taking a photo of just what you think a place should be, you might miss these cool international details that are there all along, but you just have to pay attention to realize that they're there.
That's
incredible.
Yeah, there's so many cultures you can explore, even just being in a metropolitan city nowadays. Like for me in London, I'm exposed to over like 70 cultures.
Oh my gosh!
Whenever I want, I just walk around. I can try Mexican food. I can try Colombian food. I can try Indian food. I can try whatever food I want and meet these people as well and talk to them and learn from their culture.
Yeah.
I mean, in my the last flat I lived in, we were 5 people living in that flat, and each one was from a different ethnicity.
Wow.
Like I was the Arab guy, and then there was an Italian guy who was originally from Peru, and then we had this one guy who was from somewhere in Africa. I forgot what's the name of the country, but he was born and raised in the UK. And then we had one lady who was quarter Swiss, quarter German, and then half Jamaican. So it was just like a blend of ethnicities, and it was so cool to learn the different cultures from each other.
Yeah. No, and that's the future of the world. I mean, the world isn't going to get any less mixed up and diverse. And even going back to Kenya, where I just was, like Kenya is many cultures too. Like there's some people, they're from different ethnicities, and so even traveling within Kenya, they feel like they talk to people with a different first language, and so I think if you're aware of that, you can travel a lot without going that far from home. One story I tell quite a bit is that like the Mexican, there's a lot of Mexican Americans in the United States. But the Mexican Americans where I live in Kansas are mostly from Zacatecas. So my sister, she wanted to take her family to Mexico, but instead of flying, she decided to go to the Mexican market and say, how do you guys get back home? How do you guys go see your grandparents? And they're like, oh, there's a minibus. It leaves every week. And so instead of paying, $400 to fly to Mexico, she paid $50 and took these buses that go down through Oklahoma and Texas and into Mexico. And suddenly she was traveling in an economy that she didn't realize existed, that just because she asked a few questions of an immigrant community here. And the funny thing is, Kansas is sort of a rural state. It's sort of a cowboy state. Well, Zacatecas is too. If you want to buy a cowboy hat in Saline County, Kansas, you know, probably the best ones are at the Mexican stores, because that's a very rural cowboy oriented way of Mexico. So it's funny how you don't have to travel very far. Kansas is right in the middle of the U.S. It's pretty isolated, yet it's also it's very international too. You know, my neighbor right here is half Swedish, right? So we had my wife and I and our neighbors had a midsummer festival back in June, and she sang Swedish songs, and so yeah, again, it's that matter, that thing, paying attention and realizing, you know, you may be in Kansas or Paris or Kenya, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be 100% of that culture, that the people could be having a much more international experience if only you pay attention. And Saeed was lucky he had an obviously international bunch of roommates, but sometimes we stay in our bubble, right? You know, to our own detriment, even at home, we stay in our own bubble and we don't really stretch that very much. And that sometimes it's cool to just ask questions. My wife is an actress, so she was in a play in DC last year. We went to an Ethiopian restaurant, and I've been to Ethiopia, so I started asking the owner of the restaurant about his country, and he was so excited because people never do that. They come and eat, but they don't ask about home. And so suddenly it was like I was in Ethiopia for a little while. You know, he was just excited to be talking about that. And so that's the fun thing. I guess that separation between travel and being at home is fuzzier now, because you can really be and be it London or Los Angeles or wherever. I mean, we just live in a very global age, and it's fun. It's not just possible, but it's a fun way to be at home too.
You made a very important point about like asking questions, right? And when you were saying when you went to the Kenyan restaurant, people don't ask enough questions. I feel like nowadays people are afraid to ask questions. They're afraid to
And
open
Rolf
up.
is an introvert. You're an introvert, right? So how?
Yeah.
Well, I think we sort of live in this social media. I guess we're afraid to be ignorant. We're afraid of making mistakes. We're in this social media world where we get mad at each other for misunderstandings. You know, Twitter has only so many words, and you say something, and then we perform offense. When in fact, humans are always, curiosity is a rewarded gesture in real life. You know, and so that's one of those things where I think, I don't know, maybe people were too busy at that African restaurant in DC, but I think people like it when you're curious about their lives. People love it when, I mean, that's one fun thing about podcasting too, right? That you get to ask people questions about themselves. I mean, you go to an assisted living facility, you ask an older person about their lives. Nobody ever asks people about themselves. Nobody is curious about their culture. I live in a very untouristed part of the United States. When people come to Kansas, I love people being curious about this and sort of telling them more about what it's like to live here, and sort of turning back their stereotypes. So yeah, curiosity is absolutely an essential thing to have as a traveler. And I actually learned that from my parents. My parents were school teachers. My dad was a science teacher. My mom was an elementary school teacher. And I took them to China once, and they barely used their passports. I was much more experienced than they were. And so I was sort of their parent. I was sort of walking around, and I was trying to keep them safe and sort of nervous on their behalf. But I realized that they had spent their entire careers encouraging their students to be curious. And so they had internalized that. So they were interested in everything. You know, they were interested in the dogs. You know, it's like, oh, look at that. They were interested in the museums and the food. And I realized that is a travel superpower. You know, if you can be curious, whether you ask questions or not, even if you ask questions of yourself, it's like, why do they drive on this side of the road in England? Or why is the food so spicy in this country? Or you know, why is everybody out praying at noon, or whatever? Then suddenly you're having an interaction with that place that pushes you past that consumer AI data level of a place, and you're actively learning about a place. And so I think that's an evergreen lesson too, that regardless of what technologies we have out there to help us, and regardless of how experienced we are as travelers, that curiosity is always useful. You know, you're never so experienced as a traveler that simple curiosity isn't going to help you. And that applies to home, like what we were just talking about, just sort of being curious about, oh, well, you guys, this is a Mexican restaurant, but where in Mexico are you from? You know, Mexico's a huge country. So then pretty soon you're learning about a very specific part of Mexico. And just your curiosity is rewarding you. Yeah, and I am an introvert, and I think a lot of good travelers are, but it sort of forces you to be an extrovert. That again, instead of
Yeah.
being too shy, it's like I'm going to ask. I'm going to be curious. I'm going to reach out and be curious about this place.
Why do introverts ask better questions than extroverts? Why are they more sociable?
Say that again, Saeed.
I was asking, why do introverts like ask better questions, and
Hmm.
why are they more extrovert, like why are they more sociable than extroverts in
Well, I
certain
think
situations?
yeah, I think extroverts are just intuitive, right? That extroverts need human interaction, so they just are intuitive. And I'm nothing as extroverts. Extroverts can be great travelers, and sometimes it's fun as an introvert to travel with an extrovert because it's
Yeah.
comfortable and suddenly they're introducing you to people. But I think
Exactly.
introverts are a little bit more strategic. They don't have that instinct to just go up and start talking to somebody. So they might say, that guy is cooking something awesome in a food stand and it smells delicious, but I don't know what it is. So I'm going to ask him what it is. And so they're much more intentional about that. Whereas an extrovert might have come up and just started talking about whatever. Suddenly you've created a mission. And so this is any introverts out there listening, that it's not a penalty to be an introvert as a traveler. And in fact, as a natural introvert, I enjoy travel because it challenges me to be more extroverted, to break out of my shell a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that I'm almost a little bit of an extrovert when I travel. Like, again, going back to Kenya where I just was, it was just fun to suddenly be in this community of people that I didn't know the day before. And we're just suddenly talking about all sorts of stuff, that they're learning from me and I'm learning from them. And we're just having a good time. And the price of admission isn't that much. At the end of the day, they were interested in me as I was in them. And it made my day better as a result.
Yeah.
Rolf, I want to ask you a question, but it's a bit of a wild one. I want to know why we've had people on the podcast talk about happiness before, and there's been tons of research on happiness, and we've come to realize that what makes people the happiest is the quality of relationships that you have. Okay, but then also you're saying here that traveling and experiences is also a huge part of happiness and living a well-rounded life. But those two things kind of come in opposition, because if you want to build relationships and have stable relationships that you can keep growing and have a community that you can grow, you can't be traveling for years at a time because those relationships aren't always, fruitful. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think that community is something that I have to be more intentional about because I travel so much.
Mm-hmm.
But my wife and I live in a rural area, and we're actively trying to foster relationships. Like she's an actress, so we emceed a festival of Kansas art councils. And one fun thing about that is that we met a lot of people, a lot of artists, musicians. Writers that we didn't know were here before, that we just needed to sort of get out of our shell a little bit. Another thing too is that even though vagabonding is about long-term travel and some people travel for years at a time, it's rare for people to spend like decades of their life traveling full time. That it becomes there's journeys of different length. Like, it's been a long time since I've traveled for an entire year at a time. I traveled for 3 months this summer, and so I think one thing to remember is that you remain a part of your home community even as you leave and come back and leave and come back. And then suddenly, like even here in Kansas, people are curious. They always come to us first when they want advice about travel, even if it's a place I've never been. They just assume I've been there, right? And so one way I serve my home community and my home relationships is being a person who can give them perspectives on the rest of the world, and then they can give me perspectives on home. There's a lot of things that I could learn more about, what happens when it's spring and we need to take care of the grass and the weeds and stuff like that. And so have you guys read The Geography of Happiness by Eric Weiner?
No.
It's a
No,
travel
that's a good
book.
book.
Yeah,
Mhm.
he travels to what are considered the happiest and least happy countries in the world, and he sort of examines why this is the case. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine, and he folds that question, the question of happiness, into the experience of travel, and just sort of realizing what makes a happy culture versus what makes a more alienated culture. And so I don't think there's a separation that you need not. And actually, it's even easier these days to travel for a long time. Like when Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta went and traveled, their family had no idea if they were alive or dead because they came back like 10 or 20 years later. But these days we can completely be present. We can Zoom our families back home. We can even do work. The digital nomad movement is something that's happened in the last 20 years. That you can be active in your work life and traveling almost full time or living in another part of the world. And so, again, I think it needs to be, and speaking of digital nomads, one funny thing is that the idea of the happiness of living in a beautiful part of the world and working in the same time is such a seductive one that a lot of digital nomads will perform a kind of happiness that they're not actually feeling. It's like, look at me on the beach with my laptop and I'm working in Bali. And so they're sort of maybe performing a kind of happiness that they're not living. They're being happy on behalf of their Instagram account. And they're just sort of trying to make people jealous when in fact, maybe it is hard and maybe they're having a bad day. So another thing to keep in mind about happiness, whether you're searching for that happiness through your home community or through travel or through a combination of the two, is being honest about it and not performing a version of that just for status regions, but realizing that happiness is a complicated thing and it involves sacrifices for community, and it can involve bad days, and it can involve sitting on that beautiful beach but being really, really upset because something is going wrong on your work on your laptop. So I guess that's another temptation we have in this age of technology, is that we can perform a version of our lives that seems better than it is. When in fact, true happiness isn't performed happiness. It's dealing with the actual complications of life. And it's about making efforts to keep those relationships with our home community strong, even when we're away. And it's it's not a magic button that you push and it's like, oh, I'm happy. There you go. I have the perfect solution. It's about, it's about the complexities of being human and giving yourself permission to live in an intentional way, instead of just subscribing to a materialistic or traditional life or whatever other people think you should be living.
Wow. I mean, Rolf, as we're wrapping out of time, that was a great answer. That's a great way to balance traveling and also maintaining your relationships. You have to be more intentional about your relationships. Sometimes I'm here and I'm not always in contact with the people that I need to be building relationships with. I could be traveling instead. What an idiot. All right. As we're wrapping up on time, let's do some rapid fire questions. I'm curious, Rolf, you've traveled around many different cultures. I want to know, what's the funniest culture? What's the smartest culture? What's the kindest culture?
Wow. Funny, smart, kind. Well, I'm going to drop kind on Kenya just because I was just there. Actually, you guys have Lebanese ancestry. I loved Lebanon. That's a very kind place. It's very outgoing. But I was there 23 years ago, where I was in Kenya like 2 months ago. And I think kindness is a cultural part of Kenya. That there's just sort of an openness and a patience. People have time to receive you in Kenya in a way that Americans could study a little bit. And I guess maybe in Lebanese culture, it's just like hospitality is a part of Lebanese culture, which is not the same thing as kindness necessarily, but it's a really fun thing to experience as a traveler. Smart cultures. Gosh, I don't know. I lived in Korea for 2 years, and I would say that's a smart culture. And I would say that Korea is one of those weird cultures that almost everybody is ethnically Korean. It's a very homogenous culture. And there are some disadvantages to that. In that I think a lot of young Koreans live very stressed out lives. It's hard to be an individualist. It's hard to chase your own dreams there, because there are these really strong cultural expectations of how things are. But I think they really value education there, and they really value just cerebral intelligence there. I had some amazing conversations with students who were speaking in their second language with me, but in a way that really, it's a cliche to say this, but I was the teacher when I lived there years and years ago, but I was learning as much as they were. So I was really impressed by how much they valued smarts and intelligence there. And then one funny, the funniest culture. Gosh, that's good. It feels like there's so many, like funny, haha, or just sort of funny, happy type.
Yeah, both. Sure.
Right. I don't know. Again, I'm falling back. I feel like I'm being a little bit cliche, but Thailand, which is where I lived
Mm-hmm.
when I wrote Vagabonding. I lived in a little
Mm-hmm.
town. I just sort of lived in a dirtbag way. I spent no money there at all. In a way, I probably wouldn't do now. I was a younger man when I wrote that book. Yeah, but
Mm-hmm.
Thai culture really has sort of a joy to it, and interactive, and they have their own complications too. But yeah, they're just there's a lot of joy and laughing in that culture. But I think that laughter is something that you experience everywhere. You know that
Mm-hmm.
that it's a smiling and laughing is sort of when done respectfully and joyfully. It's a global language. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
no, I really enjoyed the happy-go-luckiness of Thailand. I'm actually going to Thailand in a couple months, so I'm looking forward to going back there. In part because it's just a joyful place to be sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Yeah.
Wonderful. On the rapid fire question too. So, what would happen if none of this existed? If you just traveled but you didn't write anything?
Wow.
You know, I mean, it's kind of incredible. You know, vagabonding itself is just so huge and so important. Um, but yeah, what if it never existed? What if you just traveled without writing?
That's a really hard question. I get interviewed a lot. Nobody's ever asked me that before. That's really hard. Um, I think that those two, traveling and writing, are have been teased together for so long. It's just sort of been
Mm-hmm.
the water I've swam in. You know, it's like that old
Mm-hmm.
joke about the fish that swims up to another fish and says, "How's the water?" And the fish is like, "What the heck is water?" You know.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just been swimming and writing for so long that I don't really see it anymore. I would like to think, you know, I come from a family of teachers, you know, so I'd like to think that if I wasn't a writer and if I wasn't the vagabonding guy, and it's funny, I keep writing new books and people keep wanting to talk about
I
vagabonding, you
know.
know.
I'm sorry.
Um, yeah, yeah, no, and it's a good problem to have, you know,
Yeah, exactly.
when your first book is so popular that people keep wanting to talk about. I mean, people like to talk about my other books, but it always goes back to vagabonding, and so
Mm-hmm.
I'm really lucky. People often ask me like, are you get tired of talking about vagabonding? It's like no, like
No way.
what is some work that you did 20 years ago that people still get excited about? So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so totally, I think I come from a family of teachers, and I think I could have been a teacher who integrates travel into his life in a non-writing way. And I think that some people are great travel. You don't have to be a writer to be a great traveler. I think that some people, in a sense, do a better job of integrating travel into their lives for me, even though I'm a travel writer. And sometimes they work for the Park Service, or sometimes they work as teachers, or sometimes they work as entrepreneurs, or whatever. And so even though it's hard for me to imagine myself as not a writer, I'd like to think that I could be a person who maybe internalized those vagabonding philosophies and just quietly
Mm-hmm.
became a person who did that. In a way, it would be a shame because I love talking about this. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
But
if people say what's your travel philosophy, I can just give them a book instead of having to explain it.
Uh-huh.
No, but I think that, and this comes across my transom sometimes, is that people say, "Man, I want to travel the world and do it for a living," but you know, I'm not confident as a writer. It's like, whoa. You don't have to be a travel writer to be a traveler. You can just save your money, or you can find a way to travel the world professionally in a way that is actually easier than what I'm trying to do. Because as much as I love Kenya, I spent so much time taking notes. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
I like have these 3 notebooks. I haven't even had time to transcribe. These are all full of notes, front and back. Every
Wow.
page of these books is full of notes, front and back, of my experiences in Kenya. And so, to an extent, like my wife was able to experience more because I was sitting writing things down and she was experiencing things. So yeah, there's a hypothetical version of myself that actually has more time to travel because I'm not always writing things down. So
Mm-hmm.
but you know,
Wow.
Rolf, you are actually still a teacher. You're a great teacher through your books. That's
hmm.
and through these podcasts and through these interviews. Like all of your conferences, you are sharing these experiences and they're
Just became
teaching
like your
people about.
parents again.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's a high compliment. I have a lot of respect for that as a vocation, in part because I was
Mm-hmm.
raised by teachers. But yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to aspire to, even if you aren't technically a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot
Hmm.
of my audience has found me through Tim Ferriss, and he's a teacher too. You
Mm-hmm.
know that um,
Yeah.
uh, he is very intentional about the message that people get across. You know, he has a real, just as a teacher should really think about what their students are going through and what they're experiencing. As a podcaster or a writer or anybody who has good ideas, you should think about how your audience is experiencing what you're talking about, and how to communicate in such a way that you're not just sort of scratching your own back, but that you're communicating in a way that people can understand and get excited about the ideas that you're excited about. So yeah, no, I'll take that as a high compliment that I'm still a teacher.
Woo.
Yeah.
Well, Rolf, I mean, we're running out of time, so this is it. What's next for Rolf? I mean, you said you're going to Thailand. When are we going to see you do international space travel?
Right. Right.
What's next for Rolf?
It's funny. I was road tripping to a town nearby with my wife yesterday, and we're like, we need a 5-year plan because we got married pretty recently. We're a COVID couple, and she's traveled in Europe a lot more than me. I've traveled in Asia a lot more than her, and we're not in our 20s, you know. And so it's like we got to figure out where we're going to be dead someday. We got to figure out where we're going to go, and so So we're going to kind of create a 5-year plan because there's just a lot of places to get excited about, even in the United States. That like we've never road tripped on the West Coast together, you know, that she's never climbed in the Himalayas. And so that's amazing stuff. As you know, California, Washington, Oregon, those are beautiful places.
Beautiful.
So
Yeah.
I think as much as I'm not into over planning, I think that she and I need to plan about where we want to go together because the world is too big to experience everything. When you're young, you think, oh, I have all the time in the world. You get older and it's like, we're going to have to be intentional about this. And so I'm going to Thailand. She's not going with me. She has some travels that I'm not going to be privy to. Sometimes she goes back to Europe and I don't go with her. But part of our short-term plan is just figuring out how we're going to emphasize what part of the world we really want to experience together, because we've realized that we have things we want to show each other and we have things we want to experience together. And if we're too complacent, if we sort of put things off for too long, then we're going to, we're going to still love each other when we die, but we're going to regret not having made the time to go and climb in the mountains in Bhutan or whatever. So it's funny how travel is so life specific. And I was excited about certain things in my 20s. Now I'm in my 50s. My wife is in her 40s, and it's still exciting, but you still have to sort of find that energy. You don't want to get too complacent. You want to keep making life new. And one great thing about getting older is that you can make life, if you let it happen, you still can make it new, but you have to be intentional about it. And so we'll probably spend some time this winter figuring where we want to go in the next 5 years versus, again, how we want to give back to our home community, how we want to be a part of our home. And it's a blessing that we have the opportunity to have both, and that we met each other and that we get to travel together and be at home together. So that's sort of, it's not a super focused plan, but sometimes it's good to have a plan that involves planning. So that will be our conversation this winter.
Yeah. It sounds smart,
Way to go,
like a smart
Rolf.
and logical decision.
Yeah. What about you guys? Where are you guys headed?
Oh man, I need to travel soon, huh? I was planning to go to Lebanon, but I might have to change that plan sometime soon. The next place I might travel to, I really want to go to Mexico. I'm in Los Angeles. I've never been to Mexico.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Right
for me as well.
Mhm.
Well, actually, I was going to go to Lebanon as well. But, we were going to meet up there, me and Adi, because we haven't seen each other in a couple of years, and we were hopefully going to try to do some live podcasts or do something in Lebanon. But also, I'm still not sure whether I should go back. So I was thinking of doing a solo trip to the Netherlands. Never been, so I was like, yeah, why not?
Yeah, no, it sounds good.
Ralph.
Yeah, well, in the meantime, you can walk until your day becomes interesting in London
Let's
and
go.
Los Angeles, right?
That's what I was saying. I'm literally planning. Yeah, every weekend I'm planning to like go on long walks, like from downtown LA to the beach, or from downtown LA to the mountains or such. Just like hours of walking. That's the way to do it because things happen. Things happen when you're on a walk.
I couldn't agree more.
That's the philosophy of Rolf Potts.
Yeah.
That's why this is important right here. But everything else, you'll be a fool to miss out on Marco Polo, Souvenir, and the new Vagabond's Way. I mean, you'd be such a fool to miss out on this philosophy because it's your own brain, your own philosophy. What else is there? Right, Syed?
Exactly.
I love it.
Rolf, if there's one question that you can leave for our audience to ask themselves so that they can become better versions of themselves, what would you suggest they ask themselves?
Maybe what do you really want to do and why aren't you doing it? I think because sometimes we don't admit that we really desire to do something. Obviously, I'm a travel guy, so I think a lot of people, they keep their travel dreams inside. And I've always said that the journey begins now. Even if you can't physically do the journey in 2 years or 5 years, deciding to do it means the journey has begun. And so, be it travel or talking to the pretty girl in class or whatever,
Mhm.
what do you really want to do, and why aren't you doing it? And because again, giving yourself permission, be it to travel or to just live a more expansive life, or to spend more time with your family who you love, think about that focus. I think because we live in an age of distraction, it's so easy to distract ourselves out of our core life.
Yes.
And we keep those burning questions inside, and we're so distracted that we don't really bring those questions out. So think about what do I really want, and how can I make it happen? And that's a great thing to keep in mind.
That's great. That's an amazing question for people to ask themselves. And Ali, do you want to do the sign out this time?
Yeah, beautiful podcast. Thanks, Rolf Potts. Once again, international podcast. Here we are. Check out Rolf Potts on his socials, his books. At Rolf Potts. Incredible. We did it, folks. And we're out of here.